All right, welcome everyone to our session today, All Colors Belong in Nature. Just a couple of housekeeping things to mention before we get going. The live captions are enabled here in Zoom today, so if you would like the transcript going, there is an option for that at the top of the screen. It might be under More. If you're not seeing the option right on the menu there for you, you can have the live transcriptions happening as well as open it up almost like a chat box and see the whole transcript all at once. If you're having any issues with the live transcript, please let me know. Just send a message and we can help you out, or anything else that you need help with tech-wise as we get going today. I'm just checking off my notes of things I want to get going. All right, so we'll start with the basics. My name is Jacqueline Ngachi. I am the Education Director with CPAWS Southern Alberta, and I'm really happy to be co-facilitating today with Annalisa Badalou, and she will be introducing herself a little bit more shortly on. So welcome to our workshop, All Colors Belong in Nature. Along with Annalisa, this event is being co-hosted by CPAWS Southern Alberta, and CPAWS is known as Canada's Voice for the Wilderness. So our chapter, Southern Alberta chapter, works to safeguard, connect, and expand Alberta's parks and wilderness through education, engagement, and collaboration with Albertans. And I want to have a thank you to Science Odyssey today. We've had the last 2 weeks of amazing celebration of science as part of Science Odyssey. And this is run by NSERC, and they are supporting the sessions that we're hosting today. And check it out if you want in the future. It's every May. It's always 2 weeks of fun science activities. So keep that in mind for the future. And I think the last housekeeping thing that I want to mention before we really get going is that this is your time. So much like Annalisa was kind of mentioning at the beginning, we want you to be able to reflect on, discuss your experiences with us today, ask questions, clarifications. So please utilize the chat feature. You can put questions and comments there. You can also use the raise hand feature so that we can get you to come off mic and go a little bit deeper into some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. So this time is for you, and we really want it to be an open, collaborative session. So to begin, we would like to get to know the folks that are in the room with us today. I'm going to copy this into the chat, which is also on the screen. That we're hoping that you'll share with us in the chat your name, a bit about your family, whoever that may be to you, where you're from, and that may be different, probably is different for a lot of us, of where maybe you're living today or even just tuning into today, and your connection to the land. And I'm going to pass it over to Annalisa to introduce herself first while we see what is... Sorry, I'm just seeing from Melanie. So we've got the live transcript going. I'll see if I can move it so it's just out of the way of some of the text there on the screen. Thanks for letting me know that, Melanie. And Annalisa, take it away with your introduction.
Thanks, Jacqueline, and thanks, Melanie, for letting us know. This is actually an interesting insight. Sometimes when you try to make things more inclusive, then something else happens. So really good lesson for us here today. As Jacqueline mentioned, my name is Annalisa Badalou. Really happy to be here and chat about these very important issues with you. So I also love this method of introduction, and I'm just going to dive into it. So in terms of family, you know, I was always one of those kids, and I continue to be one of those adults that's always stopping and chatting with any animals that I encounter. If I see a tree or a plant that I feel particularly drawn to, that doesn't stop me. I'll go ahead and have a chat. I've learned in the process of doing that, which I'll tell you a little bit about later today, that there's a lot of ways to spend time outdoors. And I've learned, for example, that there's some friends of mine that I don't go walking with them because what I do, my stopping and talking to plants and animals, it drives them crazy. right? These are the people that just want to hike and do it. So, I've learned a little bit about that. So when I see my family, the plants, the animals, I do take the time and greet them and say hi to them. But I have a human family as well. And although I was born in Canada, my parents were born in Trinidad and Tobago. Some of you may know where that is. It's usually referred to as in the Caribbean, but more accurately, it's just right off the coast of South America, very small island, just right off the coast of Venezuela. And that's an important distinction because later on today, we'll be talking about what the realities are in newcomer households, and not just for kids that are newcomers, but if their parents are newcomers, like in my situation. So that's a little bit about where my family is from. And I am joining you today from beautiful Toronto. I live in downtown Toronto. And for those of you that are familiar, I live in the East End and right by the Don Valley. And this was definitely a very deliberate move of mine. Some of you may know in Toronto downtown, you tend to be either like a West Sider or an East Sider. And I grew up in the East End, but then lived in the West End for most of my adult life. And then a few years ago, I think it was a salmon swimming upstream kind of situation. I just had this very strong feeling I needed to move back to where I was born. So I did that. And this allows me to be within walking distance of the beautiful Don River. I saw a muskrat there the other day, which naturally I stopped and greeted and said hey to. And the valley itself is a beautiful, beautiful place. So I'm really happy to be living in this particular part of the city and be connected to the land. And how about you, Jacqueline?
Yeah, thank you so much, Annalisa. So my name is Jacqueline Ngachi, and I come from a family of 5. I've got 2 older brothers, Paul and Jeff, as well as my parents, Jim and Lynn. And that family obviously has grown over time. So my husband's name is Pedro, and we have a little niece and a little nephew as well, Luna and Idris, that has been added to our family in the past couple of years. I was born here in Calgary, where I'm tuning in with you today. But when I was 5, we moved out to an acreage on the grasslands of Alberta. So I really identify with the prairies, as well as really have that connection to the land through agriculture and food. My family had a market garden, primarily where we grew tomatoes in greenhouses. So I really grew up connected to food and land and just exploring all around, mostly on my own, as my older brothers wanted to do their own thing. So I was kind of left to my own devices throughout the farmlands. And today I'm coming to you from Calgary, and I'm going to share a little bit more about that as we go along today. So this type of introduction that Annalisa and I have just done, as well as I see everyone sharing in the chat, which I really appreciate. I love hearing all of your stories. So this type of introduction was shared to me by community members of the Blackfoot peoples, primarily in Guyana, or the Blood Reserve. And I was taught through a lot of time that I spent there as part of my Master's of Education program. I got to spend a year learning with elders and community members in the Blackfoot nations. And really what I was taught is that land acknowledgements are something that have been happening for thousands of years, forever. This isn't something that has just magically appeared with Truth and Reconciliation, but it really was a way to get connected to folks, to meet people that you might come across that you hadn't met before, and to understand where they're coming from, who their relatives are, their ancestors, what place they're coming from. So really this value, this importance of people and relationships and land and place are shown in this type of introduction or land acknowledgement. So at CPAWS, we like to use this one to get to know who it is that we're talking with. And I will share a little bit about the land that I'm coming to you on. And if this is a resource that you haven't seen before, I'm going to add it into the chat at native-land.ca. So if you want to learn more about the land you're from or you're living on today, more about the peoples from that land, definitely check out that resource. Every link and resource that we share throughout today will be in a follow-up email that I'll send out next week. So I do want to say that I'm grateful to be speaking to you today from Treaty 7. My Master of Education program that I mentioned included studies in Blackfoot ways of wellness throughout the lands of the Siksikaitsitapi, Sitapi, or the Blackfoot Confederacy. And that's comprised of the Siksika, the Kainai, Piikani, and Amiskapi Piikani First Nations. Not only is Treaty 7 the traditional territories of the Siksikaitsitapi, Sitapi, but also the Tsuut'ina First Nations, the Stoney Nakoda, which is comprised of Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, the Ktunaxa Nation, and the Métis Nation of Alberta. Oh, Annalisa, is there anything you'd like to share about the land that you're coming on today?
Indeed, there is. And I mentioned I was from Toronto, one way to say it. Another way to say it is that I'm on the traditional land of mainly the Mississaugas of the Credit, but a few other groups as well, which would be the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And those are things that I very much keep in mind when I do go to the Don River. You know, as I said, knowing that that river had such a strong role in, the lives of all of these groups.
Thank you, Annalisa, and thank you for everyone sharing in the chat. So great to hear all of your stories. And it's so great to think about the many different people who have lived here and do live here on this land. There are so many stories that are deeply rooted within the land. And by living and breathing on this land, we are becoming part of that story, including the students that you're working with. So today we're going to be looking at how we can make nature and outdoor education more accessible and inclusive for all of our students, and how we can bring them into the story of our shared landscape. But before we can really do that, we need to understand that the barriers that they might be facing in getting outside, connecting to nature, and learning about the environment. And so we're going to invite you to Jamboard. We're going to be doing several activities today on Jamboard. You can utilize your computer with the link that I'm putting here in the chat. You can also do it on the app if you have the app on your phone. And the first activity that we have here on Jamboard is to invite you to add some sticky notes about barriers that your students or your groups might face that you've seen so far. You can start doing that. I'm going to point a few things out here on my screen just for folks to get some ideas of how to use Jamboard. So here on the left-hand side, the image that I've circled, that's your sticky note button that you can use to put a sticky note onto the slide. Feel free to move your sticky notes around. If you see folks that have similar themes, you can kind of group your sticky notes up into themes. And just one hint here at the top that we don't want to press the clear frame button, even if we want to edit something that maybe we've done, because the clear frame will clear what everyone has done. So we just want to avoid that. And throughout our session today, we're going to be using Jamboard as sort of a brainstorming to get the juices flowing, but we do want to deepen the conversation verbally whenever possible. So please feel comfortable to bring questions, comments, ideas, stories. Maybe you need to elaborate on your sticky note and bring that to us. You can use the raise hand feature. You can use the chat feature to either add something in there or request for some airtime, because this is our conversation today that we're going to have together. So I'm just going to pop over to the actual Jamboard. And I see lots of beautiful sticky notes already coming up, so we'll be able to see those there. And maybe I'll turn it over to Annalisa to start reacting to what we're seeing so far on the screen.
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. And thanks, folks, for partaking of this Jamboard exercise. I see that there is no lack of barriers. You folks just jumped in there right away. So while you folks are putting this on, I wanted to take a step back and look at what some of the context is for some of the barriers that you folks are putting on today. Now, sometimes when we talk about youth of color, sometimes when we talk about newcomers as an immigrant youth, we tend to think about them in one category. And, we're not really doing anybody any favors by doing that. As I mentioned initially, there's quite a big difference between, you may have kids in your classroom that you're dealing with that maybe are, not from Canada, and they and their whole family have moved here from Canada. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a poverty situation happening. There's a lot of different circumstances under which people come to Canada, and there's a lot of different circumstances of, what their life looks like after that. For some people, the fact that, depending on the country they're coming from, the fact that they are able to move to Canada indicates that they have a certain either social status or they have a certain financial status, at least in their own country. However, as we know, when people come here, there may be difficulties with gaining the same type of employment. And I mention this because it's a very significant factor in terms of what the parents may be experiencing of the kids that you're dealing with. In my particular example, I actually come from a teaching family. Both of my parents were English teachers in Trinidad. And when they came to Canada, they took one look, which I literally think was just one look, at how the schools are run here, and they refused to teach here after that. Because something that a lot of white individuals in Canada don't know is that for certain countries that were under colonization, especially British colonization, the school standards are actually much higher. I can tell you that I've had a number of cousins move here who actually were just put up a couple of grades, not necessarily because they were so brilliant, but because the school system there is, the standards are much higher. So then parents come here, they may not be able to find the same job because these qualifications are not always accepted. And what does that mean for the kids that you may have in their class? It means that spending time outdoors is not exactly a priority. Right? When you move to a country, even if you've come here in relatively affluent circumstances, you still have to learn how to live in this country, right? There's a lot to learn. Even if you speak English, there's still a lot to learn. And when kids are in the classroom, when they're outside, when they're asked to go home and maybe ask parents for money or for time to do some of these outdoor activities, one thing that you may not realize that happens is that these kids, they're having to make a case to their parents. So as adult educators, when you're perhaps sending, forms for trips or whatnot, there's kind of an assumption that, the kids will be very happy to go and the parents will be very happy for the kids to go. But this may not be the case. And some of the barriers that we're seeing you folks put up here, pardon me, really quite speak to that. And I'm just going to take a look at a couple of them. I mean, certainly the fact of not knowing how to be outside is a really big one. Because my parents are from Trinidad, which is a tropical country, there's a rainy season and a dry season, and that's it. This concept of even getting winter clothing is not something they dealt with. We're also seeing here that there were no adult mentors. Well, that's the case as well. So for teachers, you have to consider that when you're looking at these outdoor activities, please don't assume that either the parents of your students or the students themselves know how to do certain things. I will relate an incident of where I was in grade 5 or 6. And I remember there was a really exciting to almost everybody in the class but me, winter camping trip that we went on for a weekend. And for my family, this presented a lot of problems. First of all, the activities being presented were very much skiing, were very much skating. We didn't have the money to be getting those type of equipment. I didn't know how to do those things. My mom didn't know how to do those things. She was raising me as a single parent. And it put me in a very difficult position because I did manage to get some clothing and a bit of gear. But when I went on that trip, because that's all that was offered in terms of skiing or ice skating, I couldn't really participate. And I really felt very left out. And when I look back on it, there was no need for that. There was a forest there. There was all kinds of amazing amenities there that either I could have explored, the teachers could have helped me explore, even my peers, but that wasn't the way that things were set up. So I just want you folks to realize that sometimes what you think of as a really cool, fun activity can actually be something that ends up causing stress for the students and end up being really not a pleasant experience. And another thing I'll mention just related to what we're seeing here is perceived risk. And that's another aspect that if you've grown up in Canada, you may not realize that, as Canadians, we tend to think of forests and outdoor spaces is very safe and even stress relieving. But you may come, or you have students that may come from a country where that's not the case. It's not always the case that forests or other natural areas are considered safe. In fact, when colonization, centuries ago got really going in earnest, in many colonized countries, including Trinidad, the forest is where people would run to from the colonizers. So I think that there does need to be that appreciation. And thanks, Nikki, for your comments that, single moms from the tropics, like, winter sports are like not a thing, right? And also, like, I still don't know how to swim. My mom didn't know how to swim, because when you come from a country with an ocean, as opposed to here with lakes, you can have a heck of a great time in an ocean without swimming, as opposed to, maybe a freshwater environment. So those are just a few things that are coming across to me here for what I'm seeing. Jacqueline, how about yourself? What are you thinking?
Yeah, thank you, Annalisa. And I think something that we'll probably keep repeating throughout the session is really that danger of assuming, right? We never want to assume anyone's experience or ability. And for example, I also don't know how to swim really. Growing up rurally, where we only had an outdoor pool in Alberta, there's only 2 months of the year where you can actually swim, which was also a really busy time for our family growing tomatoes and other plants. So you just never know what's going on with students, what kind of barriers they might be facing. And so we never want to make those assumptions. But as we're seeing on the Jamboard, and as CPAWS has seen quite a bit as well, there are some, kind of major themes of barriers and that sort of thing that we do tend to have quite a bit of repetition. So this list is coming from, our personal experience, what you've shared on the Jamboard, and also from a literature review that I conducted with the Master of Education program that I just finished up. And so this was looking at 10 years of literature on outdoor education, and these were some of the themes that I summarized in terms of barriers. I think I would like to move from there, but was there anything else, Annalisa, that you wanted to mention about barriers, or actually also to open it up to anyone that's been participating on the Jamboard? If there's anything you wanted to, share a little bit more in depth of, or any questions or comments, we want to make sure that's open to folks as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to respond to Nikki's comment, because Nikki has advised that they're doing some plein air, meaning artwork outdoors, which is such a beautiful thing. And Jacqueline, I think I was telling you this recently. Just last weekend, I was frolicking in Riverdale Park, a local park near to me, and I saw a woman doing some plein air painting of this tree. So naturally, I, being who I am, I went up to her and started chatting about what she was painting. And she said to me, well, actually, I'm not here by myself. There's a whole group of us. I was like, oh, and sure enough, I look over and there was, she was just by herself. There was a whole group of people sketching. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. And, for kids, I think that's such a cool thing too. So Nikki, as time goes on here, please feel free to share any insights that you've gained from doing artwork with children outdoors, because I think one of the great things is when you present, well, with adults too, but when you present kids with the same landscape or the same thing, and you ask them to either journal on that or artistically somehow reflect on that, that's actually a really nice way to see what your kids are thinking. So when we're talking about safety outdoors, and this is where I'll remind you that without safety, there can be no learning happening. There can be no enjoyment happening. So part of safety sometimes is just doing that, getting a sense. And we know with some kids, depending on the age group, they may not respond to a direct question. But if you give them another way to express that artistically or whatnot, then you might be surprised at what you find. Thanks, Jacqueline.
Yeah, thank you, Annalisa. So these barriers that we're talking about, some of them, certain ones, may exist because of systemic racism. And one of the major findings of my literature review was that mainstream outdoor education can indeed erase the experiences and realities of ByPOC youth. ByPOC here being an acronym for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color communities. Now, I want to pause here to acknowledge that I'm using this term ByPOC to facilitate communication about youth impacted by racial inequality. However, every individual, community, and nation are distinct and cannot be grouped. Individuals have unique experiences in nature and in society, and it's really important for us to keep in mind the individuality of our students. And over the course of this week, Annalisa and I have been having just fantastic conversations about terminology. And there are so many different examples of terminology. And so I'd like to turn it over to Annalisa to maybe talk about a few of these that I've put on the screen. This was a word cloud that I just quickly put together this morning. So it is by no means all of the terms that exist out there. It's just a few that we thought we might touch on.
And thanks to all of you that continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. That's much appreciated. Please keep that coming. So when it comes to these terms, so all the letters, right? All the plus signs, here they are. And I wanted to make clear that our goal here is not to tell you that such and such is the right term to use, or that such and such is not the right term to use. I think the main point we want to make is that there are a number of terms for all of these things. And today we just want to, unpack some of the nuances of these. While I'm saying a few points on this, I'd love to hear in the chat, for those of you that are working actually as teachers within school boards or whatever context you're working in, are you getting any advice from, again, your school boards or whoever is your authority of what term you should be using? Are there certain terms they say you shouldn't be using? And I'd also love to hear from you. What are you hearing from your students about what terms they prefer? So please keep those questions in mind and do feel free at any point to put those into the chat. So let me start with ByPOC. So I think that we've all seen this has come into play maybe a little bit more in the last 5-ish years or so. Before that, we were seeing a lot of POC, people of color, right? So now we have that term and then we have the BI in front of it. So of course, just to go over that term in its totality, Black, Indigenous, people of color. So there's kind of pluses and minuses as there are with every term. Now, as we see in this term, the Black and the Indigenous communities are very clearly being centered, right? So why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. We know that when it comes to how discrimination plays out in the various ways that that does play out, we know that Black populations and Indigenous populations, and of course, there's a lot of variety within those groups, are experiencing very, very high levels of discrimination, resulting in things like higher prison populations, resulting in things like greater mental health difficulties, and so on. But then there's the POC part. So personally, I understand the need to have an acronym. I'm a writer primarily, and when you need to put something into a report or an email, it kind of helps, right, from a linguistic perspective to have something. But also, as somebody who is primarily Indian, although I do actually have Black and Spanish in my ancestry, I kind of look at that term and think, oh, I see, I guess I'm in the POC. So there's the Black, Indigenous, and then kind of everybody else, Oh, I might have said hour by accident. Thank you, Melanie. I appreciate that. I really appreciate that comment. That's something I make a point not to do, and I just did it. So this is another lesson, right? I think sometimes when we're speaking about these things, it's important to be really mindful of these things. Oh, just responding to the question. Good, I'm glad. I was like, did I actually say that? I can't believe I just did that. At any rate, if you do this, as I may or may not have just done, this is kind of part of the learning, right? It's kind of that we're all trying our best here. And sometimes if you do end up saying something that somebody has an issue with, to me, that is actually a perfect opportunity for that conversation and to kind of open that up. So moving on from the ByPOC, which again, personally, I kind of feel a bit lumped in with the POC, but then again, what's the alternative? Would I want to add other letters for every possible race or ethnicity that exists? That wouldn't make any sense. And another thing too is that, sometimes if you try to include everybody, you end up including nobody. So just a little bit of perspective on the ByPOC. Now, also, there's another word here, racialized, another big contentious one. Just earlier this week, I spoke with somebody who was a big fan, and this person was a Black individual. And she said to me, you know, racialized, I do feel that that's the term that needs to be out there, because it's not just saying the person is racial in some way, they're saying racialized. So the key part is that IZED at the end. And what that really means is that it is society that is racializing people. It is something that is actually being done to people. And there's different views on this too. So my personal view is I actually quite like racialized because it does have that implication. It's being done, right, by the structures in society, by the systemic racism in society. However, I know there's other people that, for the exact same reason that I like it, that they don't like it, right? Because they're saying, oh, but that's, you know, the point, that it's being done to us. I don't like that. So again, right, different nuances to this. Now, what about the queer acronyms? I'm part of the queer community as well, and I talk a lot about this. So personally, here's the one I favor, and let's go over the letters. 2S, LGBTQIA+. So the 2S, for those that don't know, is two-spirit. And this is a term that is used by many Indigenous communities to indicate the two-spirit identity, by which I mean there's the male and the female that are coexisting. I actually had the privilege to speak to a two-spirit elder recently who was from the Cree Nation. And they told me that the way that it is thought of is that there is double the responsibility for a two-spirit person in society and in the world. The concept, the way it was explained to me, is that the male identities are more the fire keepers, whereas the female identities are more the water keepers. And you have the sun and the moon, the fire and the water coming together. And that's why there's double the responsibility. So I thought I would share a little bit about that with you. I have noticed in recent years, the 2S seems to have migrated to the end of this acronym. I don't know why this is, and I don't support it. I'm a very big fan of the 2S being right at the front, because it's a very unique identity and it has a very spiritual component. So that's just my personal view. The other letters you may be a little bit more familiar with, L for lesbian, G for gay, B for bisexual, some now say bisexual plus, T for trans, Q for queer, I for intersex, A for asexual, and then the plus. So again, I encourage you to speak with your students and see what do they prefer, where do they see themselves. And a lot of individuals, and I'm one of them, I simply refer to myself as queer, you know, because I feel like that is fairly all encompassing. But some people do feel very strongly attached to one of these or one or more of these identities. So again, sometimes these things can really bring up causes for discussion. And the last one I want to mention is, the last two actually, is you'll see one here that says vulnerabilized. Literally just last week, somebody brought this up to me, and it's kind of the same idea as racialized. So there's a lot of talk of vulnerable populations, marginalized populations. But when we say vulnerable, there's a big difference. When you say vulnerabilized, again, there's the implication that populations are being made vulnerable. The fact that certain Indigenous communities, certain communities of color are living closer to very toxic sites and experiencing significant health impacts, these communities have been vulnerabilized. There are systemic reasons why that particular circumstance happens and continues to happen. There are reasons why there are far too many, because even one is too many, Indigenous communities with boil water advisories right now, just in the province of Ontario, and I'm sure in Alberta as well. So it's very important, the nuances of these terms. And then finally, differently abled is one that I quite like. Referring to somebody as disabled, I'm really not a fan of, because it doesn't put the person first. If you say person with a disability, I think that's an improvement. And differently able just kind of puts a little bit of a different context on that. And thank you all for your comments, just kind of taking a quick spin through here. Thank you all for your comments. And yes, it's a little bit of education and action here, and seeing what happens when these things arise with the teachable moments. And yeah, thank you, Nikki, for saying that you yourself identify as racialized, because you can never check the box. And, you know, I thank you, Jacqueline, also for bringing up that issue of intersectionality. And by the way, in terms of intersectionality, I just want to point out, it's kind of a buzzword these days, but when you're looking at the experience of your students, this is how I want you to think about it. it's kind of like there's these layers, right, of discrimination that build up, where some people think about intersectionality as a cumulative quantitative thing, as in, and if I use myself as an example, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm racialized, I'm queer, I do consider I put myself in the neurodiverse category as well. I can consider that I have all these things, but it's not just a matter of, 1 + 2 + 3. It's a matter of how all of these different layers of discrimination intersect with one another. So again, when you're dealing with the youth, when you're dealing with your students, maybe they are racialized, but that's not all they are. So do give some thought to those different layers.
Amazing. Thank you, Annalisa. It's such an important and captivating conversation that we're having. And feel free, folks, to keep, adding things into the chat. Raise your hand if you have a question about this or, want to share a story or a comment. I'll just make a couple of other notes here just so we can see everything that's on the slide. So BRI is one that we actually just learned about that another person from our Tuesday session had mentioned, which is Black, Indigenous, and racialized. So again, that just gets into that whole conversation of whether you prefer racialized or not. And really kind of my golden rule here is twofold. One is, using the terms that people want to be used about themselves, right? So not just putting those assumptions on, but finding out what your students or your colleagues or what have you, how they want to, how they identify, how they want to be referred to by you, as well as being as specific as possible. So I think the Indigenous community is a really good one to talk about, is that there is no one Indigenous community, right? There are many different nations all across Canada and across the world. And so if you're specifically talking about a learning from a Blackfoot elder, for example, you call them Blackfoot or you call them Siksika or what have you. We're not just calling them Indigenous. So if you can be more specific, then we're not lumping folks in together into these big categories. But of course, there are times where it can help facilitate conversation to have these. And the other final one I wanted to mention on the slide here was peers. And this one I learned from social media, but it hasn't really taken off, but it is one that I like. And I kind of maybe connect into what Nikki was saying about not being able to check the box. So peers stands for people excluded because of their ethnicity and race. And as an example, my husband, who's from Brazil, but is Caucasian, he never felt like he was included in any of these terms, but he also doesn't feel like a regular, white Canadian male. He does go through some different experiences that, say, my brothers would go through that were born here. And so he never really felt like any of those terms really connected to him because he couldn't check the box. He literally can't check the box on, diversity hiring type things. But he does suffer some exclusions because of his ethnicity. And so I just felt like that was a really inclusive one that I wanted to include. But honestly, we could talk all day about terms. So unless there's any other comments or questions that we want to bring up, I'm just checking what the last comment from Nikki here. Thank you for that, Nikki. And that Nikki's point here really speaks to my next point here, which is just a couple of quick slides, from my research, showcasing that based on everything we've been talking about, if we don't question these terms, if we don't question what's happening in our systems, in our society, then our well-intentioned efforts might actually be more harmful than they are helpful. So we want to make sure that we're being really intentional about how we are working with our youth, working with the youth. Another place, they're not our youth, we don't own them, just as we don't own the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So I think these are all really important, showing how important language is. Language can make a huge impact. And so I was able to come up with some various themes from the literature review that I conducted that really match with my experiences at CPAWS and, as a person here in Alberta. that I'll just share with you, and then I know Annalisa will address them a little bit here as well. So a few tips that we have for inclusive outdoor education. I'll just keep moving around my transcript there so everything can be read. So youth can reap the benefits of nature when they are provided with opportunities to connect with nature, particularly through new sensory experiences. So experiences that engage all of their senses. Social interaction is really important, not only with peers outdoors, but also with adult mentors. And this helps youth to develop a sense of belonging in the outdoors and provides positive experiences in nature for youth. Now, nature experiences are particularly impactful when they are rooted in cultural knowledge, language, stories, and histories. These can be the stories and cultures of your students, of yourself, your colleagues, and also of the Indigenous peoples of the land that we're living on today. And finally, having opportunities to practice environmental action allows youth to see themselves within environmentalism. So just a few kind of themes that I was able to summarize through the literature review. And I know Annalisa would like to go into depth on a couple of these.
I would. Thank you, Jacqueline. You know, I think that a lot of times, if you've grown up in Canada and if you've been doing outdoor education for a while, there's a lot of assumptions that are made about what makes kids feel safe outside. And for kids that are quite comfortable being outside, they're probably feeling pretty safe, you know, unless you're taking them to, you know, to go whitewater rafting or something like a more extreme activity like that. If you're just taking them, whether it's outside the classroom, meaning more on a field trip situation, or even just frolicking and exploring in your schoolyard. But even there can be a lack of safety. And I think that sometimes when we think about safety, we think about the most extreme form of that in terms of like actual physical harm. But I want to encourage you to think of safety more broadly. And I also want to remind you that, again, for kids who either they or their parents may not be from Canada or from this, even maybe from North America, or more importantly, from a country that doesn't have 4 seasons, I'll use that as an example of safety. I've had some very good experiences, let's say in the fall season, right, before winter arrives, really using a little bit of nature interpretation to really make kids feel safe. Because ultimately, what makes us feel safe? Well, one of the things is understanding what's happening around us. When we understand what happens around us, then we can understand why there is no reason to be afraid of it. So here's a couple examples. You know how it is in the fall, squirrels are running around, right? And they're looking pretty erratic. And especially for a young child, we think of a squirrel as a rather small animal, but when they run around and they run right at you, it can be a little scary. And, you know, I've spoken to a number of kids in this situation and just explained, well, you know, winter's coming up and squirrels are really busy. They have to be gathering nuts and acorns, and they can't be going to grocery stores, you know, like we can in the winter months. So that's what they're up to right now. So when you see a squirrel running around, just wish it well, wish it good luck on its endeavors. And there's no need to be afraid because they're not coming for you. They don't even care about you, actually. They care about getting their nuts and setting themselves up for success for the winter. Well, after that, you know, these kids really do feel better because when they see a squirrel now, they're not sitting there kind of, you know, accidentally tensing up because they're afraid it might run towards them. You know, they're sitting there and they understand what they're doing now. I worked at the Royal Ontario Museum for a while. I should say volunteered there for a while. And there's a section of the museum that is called a hands-on biodiversity gallery. And I love it because it's the only part of the museum where things are not behind glass and the kids actually get to touch things. Well, we had this beehive there. And as you folks know, with many wasp and bee species in the fall, the males, they're out, right? They basically leave, they basically pass away. And it was very interesting when the families would come in because many, well, even people that grow up here don't know that. But when you would tell the families things like this, even while they're walking away, they're still having the discussion. And it helps them understand when you see a wasp in the fall and they're kind of going crazy. Again, they're really desperate, they're hungry, their food sources are dying off. So things like this, that as an educator or as somebody that has grown up here, that are just second nature to you, do take the time to kind of pull it back and think about things that are really basic, may seem really basic to you, but to one of your students, to a youth, certain pieces of information are actually extremely helpful in establishing safety and knowledge of the landscape. And don't forget that as a teacher, you don't only have that kind of power dynamic where you can share your own view with the students, you also have the power within reason to allow those students to engage in peer learning themselves. So maybe there's some of your students who are a bit more familiar. Maybe those are the ones that can support some of the other students. We've all seen those kids that are natural teachers. You know, they're just looking for an opportunity, really, to help their peers. So when we see what's here on this slide, I think a lot of these things are coming into play. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of what I was saying, the novel and the sensory aspect of that connection. So thanks, Jacqueline, for this slide.
Thank you, Annalisa. And I think what you've just said about that peer-to-peer learning is so important for teaching social justice. It can be a tricky concept to bring up in the classroom, but we've seen that across different ages, it is a topic that students are passionate about, they're connecting with, they're aware of, the sense of disparity across social groups. And so these are really important conversations that we can have in the classroom at different levels, depending on the age of the students. So using some of the strategies that we've been mentioning, we want to empower students to become advocates for social justice in the outdoors. We want them to know that we welcome these conversations and we can create safe spaces to have these discussions. And we want students to be able to support one another when they do see, their peers facing barriers. And that brings me to an example of how we can work with some of this in the classroom. So sometimes making connection to social justice could be as simple as adapting an activity that you already know. And again, I'm going to include these links in the follow-up email. But the first is a link just to a quick video of how to play this game, Pip, Squeak, and Wilbur. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's a kind of fun running elimination game. And I won't take time now to really go through that. But this is just to show you an example that you can take something that you already know and do in the classroom and apply some social justice concepts to it in order to bring these conversations into the classroom. So for example, and again, I won't take time to go through all the instructions, but we've taken Pip, Squeak, and Wilbur and morphed it into an activity we call Nature Mine, Nature Yours, Nature Ours. And I've put the instructions there in the chat for that as well. And essentially this game is around collecting nature experiences. So instead of bean bags in the middle, we have something like cones, pine cones, and each of those represent a nature experience, which we get the students to come up with a list of what those could be. So for some students, they might immediately think camping, skiing, hiking. Other students might think a walk around the neighborhood, cloud watching out the window, going on a picnic. So every student's going to have different experiences that they might bring forward. And then this is an elimination game, somewhat like a musical chairs type idea, where we are going to brainstorm those barriers that we've been talking about so far today as a class and eliminate nature experiences based on those barriers. Talk to the students about how that feels to not have all of those nature experiences or not have equal access to those nature experiences. And then at CPAWS, we always love to bring our activities and our games back into a hopeful direction towards the end. So then we want to come up with solutions. So then we have the students themselves to brainstorm how could we have solutions to those barriers that we might be facing, and therefore we can add nature experiences back into the game so everyone is playing and getting equal access, or even beyond equal, equitable access, getting what they need in nature. And so do feel free to check out that on our Bring Nature homepage that I've just listed, and you can always reach out to me if you need any further instructions on that activity. But this was really just to demonstrate that you can take what you're already doing and apply some different concepts to it so that you can bring these ideas into the classroom. So we're going to move into an activity for the rest of the presentation. We're going to be showcasing two different schools, an urban and a suburban school in Calgary. And as you walk through the schools, so we have a couple of videos, we want you to think about how we can create the most nature opportunities for our students. And so I'm going to paste these questions in the chat. As you go through as we watch the videos, I'd like you to think about how you feel as we walk through these schools. We have a couple other questions, kind of prompting questions to help you delve a little bit deeper into that. What facilities are available? What nature opportunities are available? How might you utilize the space as an educator? How might you encourage eco-action? It's just a few things to think about. We'll be able to take that to the Jamboard. So depending on how you learn, how many screens you have up, that sort of thing, you can either, as you're watching the video, you can start adding sticky notes to the second slide of the Jamboard, or just watch the video, reflect as you're watching, and then we'll have time to pop to the Jamboard after. Just to give a bit of context too, we've been walking through the schoolyard up to this point, and we're just about to leave the schoolyard to a adjacent city park where the students do have blanket field trip forms. And with their teachers, go out any day of the week and access the city park without doing, more paperwork with the parents. So please join me on Jamboard to the second slide here. How did you feel walking through this school, and any kind of notices of what you felt, what you noticed, what's accessible, what you could do with that space? Feel free to add some of those things in there.
Well, it looks like people have some ideas. Looks like that was a pretty inspiring walkthrough. Certainly compared to many schools in downtown Toronto, this is rather a dreamscape in terms of the space available, in terms of the amount of plants as well, which I think is wonderful. And boy, these lucky kids to have access to this whole other space as well. And even no extra permission forms required. That's fantastic.
Exactly. The families and the administration have taken away some barriers by making it easy for teachers to access those spaces.
You know, I kind of wish that model had been around when I was younger, because as I was mentioning, sometimes, you know, kids are the ones that have to end up making the case to, you know, to their parents for signing certain forms or going on certain trips. So this kind of, you know, removes that possibility. I like how people are, I'm just going to mention a couple of key words I see here coming up. There's the word exploration, and exploring is coming up a lot. So that's good news. You know, if you see a landscape like this, there's a lot of ideas coming forward. Curious, intrigued as well. I also love the bird singing, which was wonderful. And also somebody's mentioning that there was like a raised garden bed, and that this, speaking of accessibility, yes, I'm a very big fan of that as well. Raised beds are wonderful. I mean, not only for teaching children how to grow things if you don't actually have that in-ground planting space, but also for individuals in wheelchairs. On a side note, also for seniors, you know, there's a lot of really great gardening activities happening there. And people are not only referring to the bird song, but also linking that to some potential bird related activities as well. So this is really good. What about you, Jacqueline? Anything that's resonating with you here?
Yeah, I just love, you know, the creativity that's already coming up on the Jamboard, and how easy it feels for teachers, educators to be able to use a space like this. So it is one of my favorite schools in Calgary, and definitely if I was a classroom teacher, that's where I would want to get a job. It's would be just amazing to work there. And as we can see, I'll pop back over to my PowerPoint, but feel free to keep adding there onto the Jamboard. The possibilities really are endless. And so we've just taken a bit of a bird's eye view here of some suggestions on what we could do with that space. And what's going to be interesting is how we compare it to a more urban school. So we're going to watch a second video, same questions, same Jamboard, just onto the next slide whenever you feel like you're ready to move from the suburban school to the urban school slide. Again, feel free just to be in the video and then answer the questions when we get to the Jamboard after. So I'm going to start that one. All right, so feel free to hop back with us to Jamboard, to the third slide there. how did you feel as we walked through that school? Same kind of prompting questions. What facilities did you see available to make nature more accessible? What nature opportunities are available? How might you utilize the space?
Well, as you indicated, Jacqueline, this is definitely much more of an urban environment. So we're certainly seeing some differences, although there is actually still a fair bit of space for an urban environment. There's definitely a lot less of it. We're right up against the road there, so definitely some car traffic, some dogs maybe that may be concerned. There's a few things going on there. And I know I'm particularly excited. I'd love to see the school at a different time of year to see how they've used some of that planting space that I'm seeing. That would be really amazing. And I think that there's, somebody's mentioning putting some native plant species into the flower bed. Absolutely. I was actually recalling a planting activity that even as young as I think it was literally grade 1. And I've done this with a couple of kids after that, which, has been very well received. Native plants are always ideal, just to reflect this person's comment, because native plants need, you're usually eliminating the need for any toxins like, pesticides, chemical fertilizers, because they've grown, these plants have, from an evolutionary standpoint, they've grown up there, right? They're very well suited to the soil, the sun, the climatic conditions. And you also may notice with kids that they can get very attached, right? Whether you have like a classroom pet or a classroom plant, kids can get quite attached. So, I know, Jacqueline, you and I have talked before about the fact that when we're doing these planting activities, whether that's trees, flowers, what have you, there can sometimes be a lot of emphasis on the planting and then not as much on the maintenance. And the maintenance part is a really good lesson for kids and also extends the activity throughout the year, right? But if you're planting and there's not a lot of maintenance going on, that child is probably going to be quite devastated, when that plant is all of a sudden, maybe the plant has passed away, maybe it's simply not looking healthy, and they'll think about all of the time and the emotion that they've invested into this plant. So, just a point to say that planting is usually considered kind of the fun, sexy activity, but, maintenance also, and it can help kids just kind of keep that going. And it gives the meet a tree more meaning. That's true. I think that when, as adults, if we have certain routines in our lives, pandemic maybe has changed it a bit. If we take the same route to work every day, if we walk through the park, if we have certain parks or certain trees on our property or where we rent, you really do develop a relationship with those. Just recently, for example, every spring I go on what I call the Magnolia Tour, which is just like my own personal tour of my neighborhood, because I have all the magnolia trees in my mind. So I think that when it comes to this one, there's a lot of plant-based opportunities. And even nature-based running games, as somebody's mentioned. Somebody's also mentioning container gardening. Fantastic, right? So even if there's not a lot of that planting space, and I love the mention of the use of the existing art and also the suggestion that there could be art created. I'm going to actually somebody put a link in here. I'm going to put a link in if I can. Some of you may know the National Audubon Society from the States that does everything to do with birds. They have a great project where they've worked with a art gallery in New York, and they've identified the birds that are most threatened by climate change. And there's murals all over New York of these birds now. May not be able to do that at a school, to talk with your administration about that, but you get the idea. What do you think, Jacqueline, about the comments that are coming in here?
Yeah, fantastic. I think, as you said, it's a fairly big urban school. Not all urban schools have this much space. And it is very much urban compared to suburban, but I just love seeing the creativity that everyone has coming in, both in the chat and in the Jamboard. If we have space that we can play games, then we can, bring in different concepts into those games. I see from the chat and from the Jamboard, like utilizing the chain link fence, right? Bringing in plants. Maybe there are 0 plants. Like this school actually did have quite a bit of trees, but maybe we have to bring in potted plants, we bring in flowers during certain seasons, or bring in potted plants into the classroom, right? We can also bring nature indoors when it may not be accessible in certain seasons, or at least we might not see the growth that we see in the spring. And so, just like we're seeing on the Jamboard, there's so much creativity that we can have if we give ourselves a little bit of time and space to think about how we can maybe adapt some of those activities, like meet a tree. Maybe you don't have any trees, so you meet a flower, right? Or you bring in branches or leaves or cones and you meet those. So there are different ways that we can address the barriers or the lack of what we might have at our school and still be able to provide really valuable nature experiences for students. Was there anything that anyone wanted to jump off of being muted or into the chat or anything? I just want to make sure there's space for folks to have some of these ideas. Time to share. And I think, Annalisa, you had some really great things to share in some of the other sessions and some of the discussions that we've been having about utilizing these concrete spaces. So I wondered if there was anything else you'd like to talk about at this time.
Sure, thank you. And this is where I remind you that I'm downtown. If you hear that siren that's going by, despite the fact I have my window closed, sorry about that. Little slice of urban life for those of you that are in the rural environment. Yeah, well, Jacqueline, I think when it comes to the urban school environment, which, as you said, this is actually quite a lot of space for one, it really comes down to creativity. I had an experience just a couple of weekends ago. One aspect of my family I did not mention in the beginning was my partner. My partner has she has a daughter and she has 2 grandkids. These grandkids are just the joy of my life. I love these kids so much, and I love frolicking outdoors with them. And we went there, and actually, you know what happened? So there's a 1-year-old, and it was the 1-year-old's birthday. And then there's a 3-year-old who was getting a little jealous because that was the first time that she'd seen someone else in the household having a birthday but her. So I thought, you know what, this calls for a nature-based activity because I see she's feeling a little left out. So we went to the backyard, and I'm being real generous when I say backyard. I mean, this was like a 2-foot by 2-foot area. There was 1 tree, there was, I think, 1 shrub, and there was some just like a bare patch, of ground. And we had a great time, honestly. She was about 3.5. And we looked at different barks. This speaks to your point, Jacqueline, earlier about the sensory approach for kids. So we felt some different barks. We noticed there were differences. Some felt rough, some felt smooth. Naturally, she wanted to start peeling off the bark, which gave me a chance to get into a little botany, and explain that the bark is like what our skin is like. So we don't want to be tearing that off, and we want to be very gentle with the tree. We saw in the bare patch of earth, we saw a couple ants, we saw a couple potato bugs. That was enough to start a very lively discussion and using our imaginations about what they were up to. What did they do when they went underground? Because we couldn't see it. Why were they above ground? What were they up to? We got a chance to contrast a butterfly with a moth. We talked about antenna and what they do. So anyway, I could go on, but these are just some examples, right? Of you don't need a big space. You don't need a whole forest. You can have a few blades of grass. You can have 1 tree. And really, I do understand that, especially for teachers working within the school system, there's a lot of constraints, right? You're thinking about the curriculum, there's a budget, there's your school administration, there's the politics within the school, and so on and so forth. But I just want to encourage you strongly that creativity is what will allow you to make the most. So to shift a perspective, instead of thinking about what you cannot do, start thinking about what you can do within those limitations. And just that paradigm shift will really take you a long way. And don't forget to ask the kids that you're working with, because I'm willing to bet that you can continue to throw ideas out and hope that some of them stick, but why not just ask them? You might be surprised at what you get.
Thank you, Annalisa. And that works perfectly in this kind of perspective shift, works perfectly into the last little bit of our session together today, and it's our Build a Park activity. And so again, I've linked to our Bring Nature Home resources that you can check out the Build a Park activity. And this is about being creative and, you know, thinking about sky's the limit. What could we do? How could we utilize these spaces? How could we create a space that's really inclusive, where everyone feels like they belong and is able to have these nature moments? And they don't have to be big, right? But we all deserve them. All the students that you're working with, they all have that right to access nature, to connect to it. It's part of who we are as humans, as mammals, as life on this planet, is to be able to connect. And so we want to be able to empower that. And we do that with the youth through an activity called Build a Park. For ourselves here today, and really as more of a take-home activity that I'm going to leave you with, is to build a school and to really have that perspective shift of, first of all, if you had all the resources in the world, what would you include? How would you make sure that nature is accessible to all? How could we enjoy and utilize these spaces even when they're limited? And we know that we don't have all the resources in the world. So I really like that perspective of gratitude and working with what we have, rather than just, you know, spending the time kind of lamenting what we don't have. And so this activity that I'll leave you with, it's on the Jamboard as well. You can do this as a kind of self-journaling activity if you want to do some art Friday afternoon when you're done with us, you know, to build a school or a schoolyard to your dreams. Or you can use this with your colleagues as well. So feel free to use this as a resource, and maybe host even a quick half-hour brainstorming session with your partner teacher or your colleagues or what have you. So I will provide a PDF of the Jamboard into the follow-up email that I send for you to have that creativity and that brainstorming. And in the very last slide, as part of this, we've just left you with some brainstorm or some prompting questions that will be part of the resource as well, just to make sure that we're thinking about all sorts of barriers and all sorts of experiences that students may be having that we've been talking about already today. So think about different disabilities that students may have, whether they're physical or cognitive, or, you know, stress-based anxiety. Think about increasing access, thinking about people who were maybe not born in Canada, or maybe their parents weren't born in Canada. And then, as Annalisa was describing earlier, it's a lot different. There's many different reasons why you immigrate here. So being an immigrant that came for a job versus a refugee is a very different situation. So there's all of these layers and interactions, this intersectionality. All of these things play off of each other. And the more we can keep them in mind, or really just get to know the group that we're working with, particularly if you are a classroom teacher that works with the same group of kids for a year, you have the opportunity to get to know these experiences that your students have, and the intersectionality that is impacting their lives. And then we can work towards building a more inclusive school and schoolyard for them. So before I kind of move on to some wrap up kind of comments and that sort of thing, is there anyone that would like to, you know, share in the chat or come off mute any questions or comments or stories that you'd like us to delve into today? And if yes, while I'm talking, you know, I'll pause. If no, I was also wondering if there's something Annalisa could maybe talk to us, and apologies if you've already talked about this, since this is our third session and sometimes they blur together of, you know, the conversations we've been able to have at this particular session. But there's something that some folks may or may not be familiar with called the white gaze that can really impact students even within their schoolyard. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, Annalisa.
Yeah, absolutely. You took the words out of my mouth. I was just about to launch into something about that. While I'm talking about this, I'd like to invite you all in the chat. Do you know what the term the white gaze means? Is this something that you've heard? If you haven't heard it, feel free, and no judgment, feel free to throw out some thoughts on what you think it might mean. If you have heard the term, or you've had even some experiences with perhaps being, as I have, on the receiving end of the white gaze, please also share that in the chat. So while you folks are doing that, I'll share what my perspective of that is. So naturally, as you can hear from the term, the white gaze, it is the idea, and Melanie, you're actually speaking to this as well, as somebody did in the last group. We may be more familiar, certainly as women, with the idea of the male gaze. And these two gazes, if you will, have a lot in common. The idea of the white gaze is that white individuals are looking at individuals that are not white, and there's a certain weight. And when I say looking, I mean literally looking. And when you feel this weight, it feels like there's something wrong with you, right? It feels like there's something not right. And here's how this can play out in the outdoors environment. A lot of times, racialized individuals like myself, it's kind of a surprise in the outdoors, especially when we're not right in the city, right? Even just like a little bit outside of the city. And sometimes I've had many times this happened to me. Maybe there's a trail that's like a little windy, right? So you maybe can't see something until you just turn that corner. So I'm going about my business on the trail, and I may turn a corner and a white person sees me. And then there's this double take that happens, right? So they kind of look at me and then they look away, and then I can see the wheels turning like, oh, wait a second, was that a person of color I saw? And then they'll kind of look back. And I'll tell you something, it certainly doesn't make you feel welcome in that space. And further to that, it doesn't make you feel safe either. And a final further to that is it doesn't really make you want to spend longer in that space. And this, by the way, still happens to me now. I'm not talking about entirely when I was a child. I'm talking about like current day. It happens to me quite frequently. Some of the things about the white gaze are that once you are gazed upon, whatever assumptions that individual has, they're going to come into play. So what happens to me a lot is, as soon as I open my mouth, I get told how good my English is. I get told how articulate I am. And I like to pose that question to you all. How often have you told another white individual that they are articulate? Or how often might you have told them about how good their English is? So these are things where all the assumptions come into play. And when you're outdoors, it's really quite stressful. I've been talking to you a little bit today about how outdoor experiences that all of you are, I'm sure, extremely well-intentioned and with an extreme passion for having children be involved and engaged in the outdoor environment. These are things that can make it very challenging. Now, you as teachers, and educators, well, you can't prevent the white gaze from happening. You may be able to prevent it in your own classrooms, but it's something that I'd like you to simply be aware of. Just be aware that when, not all, but when some of your students are encountering nature, in urban environments, but especially in rural environments, this is very likely what they're experiencing. And Melanie, to your point about the male gaze, if the women that are here today think, and I'm sure that you know what I mean, and what Melanie means when she talks about the male gaze, it is that kind of mentality where you feel like you cannot respond, because that is really the problem with the gaze. There's nothing to respond to. If somebody were to simply come up to me, which would probably never happen because Canadians are really polite, right? And not racist, right? So if somebody were to just come up to me and say, oh, you know what? I actually didn't expect to see, however they think of me, a brown individual, an Indian individual here. Wow, that's interesting. Well, that would at least give me something to respond to. But when they're simply gazing at you, it's a one-way interaction, right? There's nothing to respond to. So I simply want you to be aware of those things. And just looking at the comments here, yeah, thank you, Nikki, for mentioning this. That's a really good word, disorientation, because that really is what it can feel like. And, Melanie, also, and thank you for your comments, Melanie, you're asking a really good question. What are compassionate ways to address the white gaze? And Melanie, you say, I'm always prone to going to judgment rather than compassion. Yeah, I hear you. I think that there's a strong place for white allies to kind of use your privilege in this environment. So, I would say that sometimes the best way is to simply say something in the moment. a lot of times when something, and when I say something, let's say you are somewhere and you actually see that happening, right? I'm going to share a link in a minute to a really amazing report that Nature Canada put out last year that's called Race and Nature in the City. And it raises some very important issues that, racialized youth in particular face. Without going into that report in its entirety, I will point to a couple of things. Black males, for example, young Black males feel very self-conscious because you see a group of Black males, the police, some of you may not believe this, but trust me when I say it's true, police will probably be coming by. Black youth may just be sitting there doing their thing, hanging out, but this can be considered threatening, right? Either some white individuals may feel threatened, the police may feel they have to step in. Also, young Muslim females who choose to wear a hijab, which is the cloth that covers your head. Again, it's very visible. And when you're in those visible spaces, then in the outdoor space, you can feel very vulnerable because who is really there to protect you, right? It's a public space, so anything could really happen on either side. So these are things I just wanted to bring up and make sure that you're aware of. And Sherry, you're saying that in your experience, there's also the overly welcome white gaze or engagement. I'm working on a project for Pride Toronto right now. Some of you folks may know this is the organization that puts on the Pride Parade here. And I spoke to an individual who is their ByPOC ambassador this year. And I had a conversation with her about this very thing. And basically she was saying that when she goes into queer white spaces, she feels very tokenized and very othered because people are trying. So she'll have white people come up to her and be like, hey, I see you're racialized. You're welcome here. Like, I see you, like I'm woke, right? And then she's like, thank you. I think, right? Like, I'm glad you see me, but here's the question. What are they seeing? What are they seeing, right? So anyway, I don't have any answers to these issues per se, but simply, I just wanted to get across that there's a lot of things that may not have occurred to you and that I would advise you to simply be aware of or even engage in discussions because, youth are very savvy about these things. They're really just waiting to be asked. The problem is they don't often get asked, but once you asked, it's like a floodgate, you'd be surprised at what comes out.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. I really appreciate you sharing that with us. And I think there's so much food for thought for all of us to take back and reflect on. And if there's anything further in terms of, what CPAWS can do or things that you'd like to work with CPAWS on or suggestions you have, do check out our biodiversity project. This is, where all this work is coming from. And I call it a project, but really it's what everything is about, that especially our education team, but our whole team is working on now, is really trying to break down these barriers and help to ensure that everyone can have access to the outdoors, that everyone can be part of environmentalism. And so there's a lot of resources on that site that I'll include in the follow-up email as well. But there's also an invitation, if there's anything that you see us doing, that you'd like us to change or conversations you'd like to have with us, we're really open to having those conversations. So, please do connect with us on that. So we do hope that you've enjoyed the activities that we've done today and that maybe we've sparked some new questions and thoughts about social justice and the outdoors. We do have some eco-justice education programming that we've been working on with the City of Calgary and with some of their summer camps. So if you're interested in that or any of our education offerings, do check out our website. Again, all these links will be included. And just a few kind of resources and final thoughts and things like that to wrap up with folks. The first and most important is our survey. We would love to hear what everyone thought today, as well as things we can improve, topics or conversations you'd be looking to have for future workshops. So all of that can be answered in our survey that I've just linked to there in the chat. And we've got a couple of fun things that we're able to provide out of the survey today. So I'm just going to pop screens again. one of them is, sorry, so many screens. I'd just like to quickly introduce the Outdoor Learning Store. They are a fantastic resource for folks taking learning outdoors. So they are a charitable social enterprise that offers equipment and resources for sale, and 100% of those proceeds go back to supporting outdoor learning nonprofit initiatives. And through the funding of NSERC Science Odyssey, I've been able to get my hands on some gift cards. So I will be doing a draw for $150, so $150 gift card from someone from today's session. So there is a chance to win that gift card. As well, the Outdoor Learning Store themselves have donated to us a really great book called Fatima's Great Outdoors, and it's about an immigrant family that's embarking on their first camping trip. And I'll put that link in the chat as well. So Outdoor Learning Store has donated that, and I will do a draw for that early next week as well, and let the winners know how they can get the book and or their $150 gift card to the Outdoor Learning Store. And now I'm going to paste a whole bunch of links into the chat. Again, this will come out next week in an email, which will be a little bit nicer, neater to see all the links. Here we go. So just a bunch of different resources, things that we've been talking about today, the different activities that we've taken you through. A couple other CPAWS resources, Bring Nature Home. We've shared a couple of those activities, but as a whole, it's a place where educators and families can go to find ideas of activities that they can run in the home, in the classroom, outdoors, in the yard, you know, all sorts of ways that you can connect to nature in a really accessible way, as well as our Climate Game Changers Toolkit, another free online resource, which is basically a choose your own adventure. There's an adult choice and a youth choice where you can play around and learn about climate change as well as climate action. And thank you, Annalisa, for getting in the link there for the Race and Nature in the City report. I believe that's all my final kind of follow-up notices. Annalisa, any last wrap-up comments that you'd like to make?
Thank you, Jacqueline. Boy, I like the look of that book that's being given away. How appropriate to the story I told about camping. I wish that book had been around prior to me having that experience. So all that being said, first, a big thank you to you, Jacqueline, for co-facilitating the session, and to CPAWS Southern Alberta. You're doing some amazing work. And that Bring Nature Home toolkit, by the way, which I've had a look at, is really, really fantastic. So I really encourage folks to download that. You know, folks, if you leave the session with anything today, I'd like that to be two things. One of them is that, again, where safety is not, then learning is not either. So please remember to touch base with, whether it's however you're working with youth, touch base with them and really make sure to ask. Really try to recognize that there are a lot of assumptions that are being made, because we all make them, right? Whether we realize them or not. And it's simply a matter of bringing your consciousness to it, bringing your awareness to it, realizing what those assumptions are, and then simply acting accordingly from there. So that's number one. It's safety first, and then, and only then, can learning happen. Number two, do not forget that as teachers, educators, you are incredibly important to the youth that you're working with. And I'm sure that if we had more time, I would love to get into a discussion about, hey, who were your favorite teachers? Who were your least favorite teachers? And I bet that every single one of you, probably it took no longer than 5 seconds. And that's important, because that's how indelible the experience is, right? As a teacher, as an educator, you hold a lot of power. And I know it doesn't always feel like it, especially in the school system, but you do. And really, what kind of teacher or youth model are you going to be? Are you going to be the kind of person that later on, these kids as adults are looking back saying, wow, if I didn't have that teacher or this person in my life, I would have been afraid to go outdoors. I would have not felt welcome. I would have not done it at all. Or will you be the person that, kids may remember as saying, well, I kind of felt shut down or I didn't feel welcome. Well, that choice is up to you, and you have that choice not only every day, you have that choice every minute of every day, every decision that you make, every conversation you have with a child, or in fact, even with an adult. So in your day-to-day, please don't forget what a very, very important influence you are on children and that your word matters. And thank you everybody again for listening. The final thing I'll say is that when you get the evaluation form, we really would love to hear what else you want to hear from us. Several of the things we've talked about today, we have addressed in a fairly surface fashion, and perhaps one of those things is resonating with you that you'd like to hear more about. So with that, I will thank you all again, of course, wishing everybody a great long weekend ahead. Will you get outdoors? I hope so. And thank you again, Jacqueline.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. I think that wraps it up just beautifully. And thank you everyone for spending your Friday afternoon before the weekend with us. I'm going to turn off the recording and we'll stick around for a few minutes. If anyone had any final, questions or comments, we'll be here for that.